go to your criterion. You talk about how you have to preserve victim's agency, right?
Yeah.
So why do we not preserve the abuser's agency?
Because once they violated someone else's autonomy, they lose their rights to agency.
Where is this in your case?
What do you mean?
Like, you're telling me this now, but like, why should I believe you? Why are you correct?
Well, I never talk about the abuser's agency.
So, yeah, but you make this statement that we have to protect individual agency in order for you to achieve morality, right? But you never specifically tell me why.
I talk about, as far as preserving agency, I talk about insofar as it has been violated, so I restore it.
So if I violate your agency, you have the right to violate mine?
If it's in the situation, that's what I'm talking about.
So you're advocating some type of retribution.
No, not retribution. A moral restoration.
How do you restore my agency by eliminating my agency? Like, how do you restore your agency by eliminating my agency?
I'm not eliminating your agency.
Like, for example, if I went ahead and stabbed out both of your mother's eyes out and you stabbed my eyes out, are her eyes going to return? Like, are you restoring some type of balance, or are you exacting retribution?
Well, we're talking about this situation, domestic, like repeated domestic
violence.
Alright,
so if you kill the abuser, does that make you any less like susceptible to any of the abuse that has already happened?
It doesn't matter about the abuse that's already happened. We're talking about restoring their autonomy in order to not be violated again.
Okay,
and deadly force is the only way to
But you have yet to give me any reason on why we only look towards the victim and not the abuser.
Because they're the only ones whose autonomy has been violated, and I talk about that in my criterion.
Okay, that's fine. Go to your contention one. You talk about how it's proportional to use deadly force in order to regain your own life.
Yeah.
How is it proportional if the victim is still alive while the abuser is dead?
That's what I'm talking about. That's what the UN 2 talks about, because of the emotional damage that comes from domestic
Alright,
violence.
so you're saying if I'm emotionally damaged, I can take your life.
I mean,
like, you're talking about proportionality, right? And the proportionality of the consequences of our actions. So if you're doing this, and the victim is being abused but never gets killed, obviously, because it's still alive in order for you to enact deadly force. But if the abuser dies through death, at what point do you say this is proportional? I've been mentally and emotionally abused. You deserve death. How is that proportional?
Because on top of the physical abuse, there's also the psychological abuse.
Yeah. Okay. So if I've been psychologically abused, is it okay for me to take your life? That's my question. Is that proportional?
Well, not if you've just been psychologically abused.
Okay. If I've been physically and psychologically abused, but I'm not dead, is it okay for me to kill you?
Yeah, basically that's what.
Okay. So if I'm not going to die, it's okay for me to kill you because I've been abused.
Well, you are going to eventually die, because that's what the definition of.
Oh, so wait. If I'm going to eventually die, how can I enact deadly force?
What are you talking about?
So, in the instance that you are alive and you're able to enact deadly force, right? That's assuming they hadn't killed you yet. So what gives you the right to kill them at that point?
Because it's proportional.
So you assume that they're going to kill you, so you kill them before they kill you.
I'm not assuming they're going to kill me. That's what the definition of.
But they haven't killed you yet.
Always escalates.
But they haven't killed you yet. That's the question.
Okay, yeah, they haven't killed you yet.
Okay, that's fine. What does your observation 1 say?
Observation 1 is basically saying that to say that something is morally permissible is simply to deny that it's morally impermissible. So like.
Okay, so what's your observation 2 say?
I don't have an observation 2.
Oh, so it's just I have to prove a prohibition.
Yeah, it's just a burden.
Okay, so I'll just. So, is your advocacy for violence, that violence is bad? Like when the abuser uses violence to abuse you, is that bad?
Yes, that's morally wrong.
Okay. And this is determined by society, right?
You can say that.
Okay. You mind if I stay for the speech as well?
Actually, I did more on that.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. The order is going to be an NC, an overview, and the AC, and then the AC itself. Okay. Ready? Okay. I negate. First, presume negative. Claims are false until proven true. If I prove to you that deadly force is not morally permissible, you negate on phase. A morally permissible action is a positive right that can be taken by any individual in society without question of its wrongdoing. This means for anything to be considered morally permissible, it must contain a positive right to be taken. But a positive right to use deadly force with intent does not exist in any circumstance. This is because no one has the right to kill someone deliberately. And deliberately using deadly force to kill is always going to be immoral. Musler 2011 writes, wrongdoers and other killers should never be executed in our names because it is immoral to take the life of any human being on purpose. No human being wants to be killed or lose their life in any circumstance, for it is in everyone's interest to live and no one's interest to die. Even if they killed or committed some wrongdoing, no normative code allows for you to do the same or worse than said wrong, since reciprocity of an immoral action never alleviates the wrongness of a previous action, but rather causes the subject of an immoral action to become the new moral actor. At that point there lies no reason to why the current immoral actor should not also be executed for his action. End quote. This means even if an individual is subject to immoral actions, he should not reciprocate those actions, and definitely not through deadly force. This functions as an independent reason to negate, since I'm provocatively proving the resolution false while at the same time precluding any arguments in the AC about any sort of deadly force in any given situation being morally permissible, even before presenting to the NC to you. Thus, because the resolution is absent of positive right, using deadly force is not morally permissible. The affirmative has the burden of proving that deadly force is a positive right and everyone in society is allowed to take. On to the NC. I negate. Negate is to invalidate. I value morality defined as the righteous or good put forward and accepted by society. The standards is taking into account an individual sense of morality. Morality applies to only those who can understand it. SCP 2002 explains. Morality refers to a code of conduct that applies to all who can understand and govern their behavior by it. Morality should be never overridden, that is, no one should ever violate a moral prohibition or requirement for non-moral considerations. All those who use morality normatively hold that under classified specified conditions, all rational persons would endorse that quote, end quote. Rational beings are the only ones whom are aware of moral codes and thus are the only ones who may be subject to morality, including consequences for violating moral prohibitions. I contend that by repeatedly breaking societal norms and attacking said victim, the aggressor is insane or not rational, and thus is not applicable to moral consequences. First, Heyman in 94 writes, mental illnesses are disorders of the brain that disrupt a person's thinking, feeling, or mood and their ability to relate and act onto others. Being with said sickness usually do not know when they are wrong or committing immoral actions. In cases having to do with immoral actions or domestic violence, mentally ill beings are the only ones who repeat said actions because of how oblivious they are to the interests of others and the code of morality established by society. End quote. Second, a mental illness allows you to not be subject to moral consequences. Glucky 99 writes, the criminal responsibility of the special class of insane offenders is also in association with the free will and its relation to the legal guilt of the insane. When the more or less normal conscious purpose activity of a human being and the influence of mental disease or defect disturbs human capacity for rational purpose conduct causes criminals to use their free will to act in the manner that they do. They are exempt from moral consequences that a normal immoral being would be subject to. End quote. The implication is that there lies no distinction amongst the irrational because it would be wrong to kill an individual for committing an action he didn't know he was supposed to commit. It is not morally permissible to allow for the same punishment on the aggressor since he's also an irrational being. So, overview on the AC. First, an action may be considered morally excusable but not morally permissible. First, there is an innate difference between morally permissible and morally excusable. In ethics in the first person, Dudley Elliott defines permissibility. Moral permissibility means certain behaviors or actions are within the bounds of a moral system. It is morally permitted to act in any way that does not cause any others unjustified harms. According to the SCP in 2002, a morally excusable action is an action forgiven partially or entirely because of certain circumstances. To be morally excused is not moral permission, rather exemption from moral consequences for violating a moral prohibition. Second, an action can be morally wrong yet morally excusable. Audion 11 writes, to understand another application of the principle that cruelty is wrong, the proposition that attacking for pleasure is wrong. There is some plausibility in saying that we know this. Kantians hold that we hold it's an obvious application of the categorical imperative, which informs us that we not only act on principles that we can rationally will to be the universal laws of nature obeyed by us all. The proposition that attacking for pleasure is wrong seems plausible even on the brief reflection on what it is to attack. It is difficult to conceive exceptions. It is certainly difficult to conceive circumstances that will lead a rational person to endorse that they are not taking the point of universality. Cruelty, such as attacking in special cases, may be excusable even if it's not morally right. Terrorists might manipulate my brain so I change my personality and somehow is brought to an attacking individual. But even if I'm doing something wrong, it's done in an excusable way, end quote. This means that an action can be proven innately wrong and impermissible, yet excused under certain circumstances. The implication is that even if any argument in the AC is true, self-defense is utilized to protect oneself, the act of killing is still impermissible, yet we can deem the action excusable. In order for the action to be proven permissible, it must be proven to not violate a previous established notion of morality. Thus, any argument about lifting the prohibition for killing is negated, as we do not lift any prohibitions, but excuse victims for consequences for violating said prohibition. So, on to the AC. Go to his first observation, where he tells you that the negative has to provide to you some type of prohibition. The negative does exactly this at the beginning of the NC. Musser specifically tells you that the innate action of killing is always going to be wrong. Thus, we don't do this type of action. The impact is that if we deem killing is wrong, yet we do, if we deem killing is wrong, but we allow for killing to become a morally permissible act, at that point morality becomes arbitrary. It perpetuates the cycle of killing. Furthermore, you can extend this with the, you can also apply the excuse and permissibility overview, which specifically tells you that even if this issue, even if there is a prohibition and we allow for an agent to use we allow for them to use deadly force in response to repeated domestic violence, it's still not morally permissible. We can deem it excusable. We can say you are not subject to moral consequences, but the action of killing is wrong. Thus, we can say that you aren't punished for it because you're trying to defend yourself, but the innate action of moral permissibility within attacking somebody is not going to be permissible. That's what the overview says. Then, go on to his value criterion. He tells you that we're preserving a victim's agency. I asked him in the crossfire, why don't we have to look towards the abuser's agency? He talks about forfeiture, about how they lose their right once they attack an individual. First,